The tension in the air was palpable as Johannes opened the attic door. It wasn't the first time I was looking for something here, but this time something seemed different. His mother had asked for an old lamp, but Johannes was struck by a dusty, inconspicuous box in the corner. It was locked, but the lock was old and rusty. It was easy to open if you were determined. With a screwdriver in his hand and a quick glance over his shoulder, Johannes began to pick the lock. It creaked and finally opened. What he saw made his heart stop for a moment. Inside the box were papers that at first glance looked like ancient documents, but when he took them out, he saw bank statements with amounts beyond his comprehension. Millions. His father had millions of euros. Johannes sat on the dusty floor and looked at the numbers. Was your father, the man who came home exhausted from work every night and always claimed he barely had the money to pay the rent, a millionaire? That didn't fit. In the box he also found stock certificates and photographs of his father that showed him with strange, serious men in expensive suits. Without thinking twice, Johannes went downstairs with the documents and photographs. His mother wasn't home, so he put everything on the kitchen table and started going through the paperwork. Each new piece of information increased his sense of disbelief. The money was not only real, but had been hidden for years in various accounts, some of them in Switzerland. His father's name was written everywhere. A strange, tingling sensation ran down Johannes's back. His father had always talked about hard work, a simple life, and the humble values that defined his family. But these articles told a completely different story. Johannes's head was full of questions. Why did his father hide the money? Where did it come from? And above all, why were they still living in constant financial insecurity? When Johannes heard the door open, he knew that his father had returned. Peter entered the apartment, his face tired and expressionless as always. But when he saw the box on the table, his opinion changed. For a moment there was something in his eyes. Panic? Fear? It disappeared as quickly as it appeared, but Johannes noticed it. "Where did you find that?" Peter's voice was calm but sharp. "In the attic," Johannes replied, trying to remain calm. "What is all this? Why didn't you ever tell us you were rich?" Peter hesitated, his eyes darting back and forth between the box and his son. "It's complicated," he finally said. "Complicated?" Johannes's voice grew louder. "We live in a tiny apartment. I work every day to keep us afloat, and you're telling me this is complicated?" Peter sat with his hands on the table and sighed deeply. "It's not what you think. This money has a price, a high price." Johannes stared at him, but before he could ask more, Peter stood up abruptly. "Let's discuss this later," he said, grabbing the box and disappearing into his room. The door closed with a dull thud. Johannes stayed behind, his head full of questions and his chest full of anger. Whatever his father was hiding from him, it was bigger than he had ever imagined, and he was determined to discover the truth, no matter what it cost him. The night was cold, but Johannes did not feel cold. Sleeping was impossible. The questions swirling around in his head grew stronger minute by minute. His father interrupted the conversation and retired to his room, but Johannes could not get rid of that feeling of deception. The box, the documents, the sudden panic in Peter's eyes. Everything cried out for a truth that Johannes would never have suspected. The next morning there was an oppressive silence at the breakfast table. Peter barely spoke, and Johannes was determined not to give in. "I want answers, Dad," he finally blurted out as Peter put down his cup of coffee. "No dodging, no excuses. I want to know where the money comes from." Peter looked at him for a long time, his features hard as a stone. Finally, he spoke. "If you insist on knowing the truth, you must be willing to endure it. But you won't like it." Johannes crossed his arms. "I'm ready." Peter leaned back and began to speak in a calm, almost toneless voice. "When I was younger, I wasn't the man you know today. I was another person. After the war, the country was in chaos. There were men who saw opportunities where others only saw rubble. And I was one of them. Johannes frowned. What does that mean? We haul things, Peter said. Valuable things. Artwork, jewelry, documents, everything people wanted to keep safe or had lost. It was some kind of network. It is not legal, but it is not without a purpose either. Johannes swallowed. The idea that his father had been involved in such businesses contradicted everything he thought he knew. And the money? He finally asked. Peter nodded slowly. It's a remnant of that era. Profits I never wanted to touch. It was my way of dealing with guilt. I hid it. I donated it anonymously, but I was never able to get rid of it completely. Johannes stared at his father. The words sounded surreal, almost like something out of a movie, and yet I knew Peter was telling the truth. Then why did you let us live in poverty? Why didn't you help us if you had the money? Peter looked away, his face marked by internal struggle. Because this money is a curse. It destroyed lives, John, and I never wanted that to destroy yours too. The words hung heavily in the air. Johannes felt anger rising inside him. You have no idea what it means to fight every day while you have a fortune and do nothing. You failed us, Dad, out of some twisted sense of morality. Pedro remained silent. His eyes were blank, but his hands were shaking slightly. You can think what you want, he said quietly. But everything I did was to protect you. Johannes stood up abruptly, and his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Protect? Making us live in lies. Without waiting for a response, Johannes left the house. The chill of the winter air bit into his skin, but he barely noticed it. His mind was racing. His father, a quiet and modest man, had led a life full of secrets, while Johannes and his mother struggled with the harsh realities of everyday life. Johannes didn't know if he was disappointed, angry, or just lost. He walked aimlessly through the streets until he stopped in front of the window of a small cafe. His reflection looked back at him, and an idea suddenly occurred to him. If his father wasn't willing to tell everything, he would find the answers himself. He would recover the box, review the documents, and discover the truth, whatever the cost. The anger in Johannes was like an uncontrollable fire that burned every clear thought. That same night, while his father was sitting in the living room watching television, Johannes sneaked into Peter's bedroom. The box was in the corner as expected, carefully closed, but the lock was the same as before, old and brittle. With a determined movement, he opened it again and began to review the documents piece by piece. This time, one document in particular caught his attention, a handwritten list of names and numbers. Some names were crossed out, others with notes. John couldn't see the meaning of them, but it was clear that they meant something important. He also found an old black and white photograph showing his father and two other men in front of a luxurious villa. The men were dressed in suits and seemed self-assured, almost arrogant. This version of his father was completely foreign to him. She put the documents and the photo in her bag and left the room before Peter could get suspicious. John knew he had to verify these names and details to know the truth. The next day, he began researching in the city library. Using the information available, he searched for clues about the men in the photo. The names led him to old articles about post-war Germany and a smuggling ring that had smuggled valuable works of art out of the country. Johannes's heart beat faster the more he read. His father's name didn't appear directly anywhere, but the descriptions of actions and connections matched the clues Peter had given. When Johannes arrived home that afternoon, Peter was waiting for him. His face was tense, and the box was on the kitchen table. "You were snooping through my things," Peter said, his voice calm but heavy with suppressed anger. Johannes was no longer willing to hide. "You leave me no choice. You only tell me half the truth and then expect me to just accept it." Peter shook his head and sat heavily in the chair. "John, I already told you that what you are looking for will do you more harm than good. And what about me?" Johannes's voice grew louder. You have decided my entire life what I can and cannot know. You lied to me, you lied to Mom for what? To protect us? That's no excuse, Dad. Peter looked at him with tired eyes. It's not just about you. There are people, Johannes, who are still looking for me. People who think I owe them something. If you start digging into old wounds, you will not only endanger yourself, but also your mother. Johannes froze. Danger? Who are these people? And why should I be in danger anyway? Peter sighed deeply. The men I worked with back then scattered in all directions. Some of them are dead, some of them are in prison, but some of them are still out there. And they have not forgotten it. John didn't want to believe it. It sounded like a bad movie, but the determination in Peter's voice made it clear to him that this wasn't some made-up excuse. But instead of giving in, Johannes felt his anger turn to determination. Then tell me who they are. Let me understand what is really going on here. Peter hesitated, and in that moment he seemed older, more fragile. Finally he said quietly, "One name you should remember is Cole. If he finds out that you are dealing with these documents, he will find you. And believe me, you don't want that." The name was burned into Johannes's mind. Cabbage. It was the first real clue, and John knew he had to use it to find the truth, even if his father warned him not to. The name Cole burned in Johannes's mind like a thorn that could not be ignored. Over the next few days, he searched the internet, archives, and old newspaper articles. With each new piece of information, a clearer picture emerged of her father's past and the danger Cole represented. Cole was no stranger. In the post-war years, he was considered a shady underworld figure. Known for his unscrupulous methods, he had amassed a fortune smuggling art and antiques. But while other members of the network were arrested or killed, Cole disappeared, supposedly abroad. The thought that his father had once worked with this man made Johannes's stomach clench. It was surreal, but the evidence was clear. One night, while Peter was once again making his usual excuses to avoid the conversation, Johannes lost his temper. "Why didn't you tell me Cole was still alive?" His voice was loud and trembling with suppressed anger. Peter slowly raised his head. His face looked tired, almost resigned. "Because I hoped you wouldn't look any further. Johannes, you don't know what you're getting into. And you don't know what it's like to live in ignorance." Johannes's voice trembled. "Everything I knew until now was a lie. You tell me that cabbage is dangerous, but you don't explain why. If you want me to understand what happened, finally tell me the whole truth." Peter leaned back and ran a hand over his face. For a moment it was like he was fighting an internal battle, but then he began to speak. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Cole was not just my partner, he was the one who held the network together. A man who controlled everything and who knew how to pressure people." Peter spoke of the years after the war, when chaos and poverty dominated the country. It was a time of opportunity, but also desperation. We moved works of art that no one missed, or at least no one officially wanted to miss. But at some point, Cole started doing more dangerous business. He blackmailed people who wanted his treasures back and used violence when necessary. Johannes listened raptly, unable to banish the images from his mind. "What about you? Did you just participate in it?" Peter shook his head. "I knew it was wrong, but I had no choice. Cole knew how to keep people in his control, and when I finally had enough and wanted out, it threatened to destroy me. So I took my actions and left. And you thought that would solve everything?" Johannes's voice sounded harsh. "That you could hide a fortune and pretend nothing happened?" Peter nodded slowly. "Maybe I was naive, but it was the only way I could see. Money was a curse, Johannes. I wanted you to live a life away from that." His father's words resonated with Johannes. For the first time, he felt that the story was more than lies and secrets. It was also a burden that Peter had carried alone for years. But before Johannes could ask any more questions, the doorbell suddenly rang. Peter froze, and his eyes widened in panic. Don't open the door, he whispered hoarsely. But Johannes was faster. When she opened the door, there was a man standing there, tall, with a piercing gaze and a smile that seemed anything but friendly. "Mr. Müller," the man said in a calm, dangerous voice, "it's been a long time." Johannes knew immediately that he was facing Cole. Johannes felt his throat go dry. The man in front of him had a presence that took over the room, as if the air had become heavier. Cole took a step forward and let his gaze wander over Johannes before entering the room uninvited. Peter was still petrified. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Cabbage," Peter said tonelessly. "I should have known you would find me eventually." Cole sat calmly on the couch and looked around the apartment with a condescending smile. "It was only a matter of time, old friend," he replied. "And I see that you lived well, modest but good." Johannes stood motionless at the door, his thoughts spinning. This was the man who had scared his father all these years, the one behind the fortune and the secrets. Cole turned to him, and his gaze locked on Johannes's eyes. "You must be the son," he said with mock kindness. "An impressive young figure. Obviously your father hasn't told you anything about our activities together." "I know enough," Johannes snapped, trying to keep control of his voice. Cole laughed softly and tapped his fingers on the armrest. "Oh, I doubt it. Your father certainly hasn't told you how much he owes me yet." Peter tensed, his face a mask of tension. "That's a thing of the past, Cole. I have nothing left to give you." "That's wrong, Peter," Cole said, leaning forward. "You have everything to give me, and I am here to demand my part." "What part?" Johannes interjected, his voice louder than anticipated. Cole looked at him as if he had heard a funny question. "Your father owes me a significant part of his fortune. Without me, this money would not exist. And now that I know he still has it, I'll take my fair share." Pedro jumped up. "You know exactly why I hid this money. It was the only way to break up with you and your madness." Cole remained impassive. "It may have worked back then, but times change. You can't run away forever, Peter. You know how I work." The threat was blatant, and Johannes could feel the tension that seemed to fill the room. He knew that Cole was dangerous, but he also knew that his father could no longer bear that fear alone. "You won't get a cent," Johannes said with a firmness that surprised even him. "This money does not belong to you." Cole laughed again, louder this time, almost mockingly. "A brave boy. You inherited your pride from your father, I see. But pride won't help either of us. I give you a week. If I don't get my share, your little family will regret ever knowing me." He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked slowly toward the door. Before leaving the apartment, he turned around again. "1 week, Peter. You know I keep my promises." The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. Johannes wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. His father sank heavily into a chair and buried his face in his hands. "I didn't want you to get involved," he murmured, barely audible. Johannes approached. "But now I am, and we have to find a way to stop it." Peter looked up, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "There's no way, John. Cole always gets what he wants. Not this time," Johannes said decisively. "I won't let it destroy you or us." The words, "not this time," echoed in Peter's mind as the night slowly turned into morning. Johannes had retired to his room, but Peter was still sitting in the darkness of the living room, his thoughts heavy with the past. Cole was not just a man to be feared. He was a man who tolerated no loose ends. Peter knew that Cole would never give up until he got what he wanted, or until someone paid a high price. The next morning, the tension in the house was palpable. Johannes had decided to confront Cole, but Peter remained skeptical. During breakfast, neither of them said a word until Johannes finally broke the silence. "Dad, we can't let him do it. There has to be a way to protect money without it destroying us." Peter shook his head. "You don't understand how cabbage works. He will always find a way to break you, He has done it with others, and he will not hesitate to do it with you." Johannes's jaw clenched. "He may have done the same to others, but I won't let him intimidate me." Peter put down his fork and looked seriously at his son. "This is not a game, Johannes. Play with life. I've seen what he's capable of. It's not just about money, it's about power and control. And that is precisely why we have to stop him," Johannes replied. "If we don't do something, he will destroy you, me, and Mom." His mother's name made Peter pause for a moment. He thought of the years she had lived in ignorance and relative safety, and how much he had sacrificed to make it possible. But Juan was right. Cabbage would never just disappear. Peter knew he had to make a decision. Later that day, Peter retired to his room and began searching through old documents. He found a list of contacts, people who had once been part of the network but had long since left. One of them was a former lawyer who had helped Peter cover his tracks. It was a risky move, but Peter knew he couldn't take on Cole alone. He contacted the lawyer and asked for help. In the evening, he sat with Johannes. "I've been in touch with someone who could help us," he began, "but that will take time, and Cole won't have patience." "What do you suggest?" Johannes asked. Peter's expression hardened. "I'll meet him." Johannes looked at his father in astonishment. "What? You can't face him alone. That's exactly what he wants." "I won't leave empty-handed," Peter said calmly. "I will offer him some of the money, enough to appease him, but I need time to protect the rest." "This is crazy," Johannes exclaimed. "He'll kill you as soon as he gets what he wants." "Maybe," Peter said, his voice calm but firm. "But if it means you and your mother are safe, then it's a risk I'll take." Juan was left speechless. The idea that his father would sacrifice himself to protect the family was both heroic and devastating. But I knew I couldn't stop him. The next day, Peter met with Cole at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Johannes insisted on watching him from a safe distance. The moment his father got out of the car and confronted Cole was etched in Johannes's memory. Peter was calm but determined, while Cole greeted him with his usual cold smile. Peter handed him an envelope containing a considerable amount of money, but Cole did not seem satisfied. "That's not enough," he said in a dangerous tone. "You know I want more." Peter stood his ground. "That's all you get. The rest are no longer available." Cole snorted disdainfully. "You don't even believe it yourself." At that moment, Johannes came out of hiding. "And what if it is?" His voice echoed through the warehouse, and Peter's head turned. "You won't blackmail us anymore." Cole looked surprised for a moment and then laughed. "Brave boy, but stupidity leads nowhere." Johannes approached with clenched fists. "You've had enough. It's over." The tension in the room was unbearable. Peter looked at his son, and for a moment Johannes saw a mixture of pride and despair in his eyes. But before anyone could react, the sound of police sirens sounded in the distance. Peter's lawyer had informed the authorities. Cole realized too late that he had fallen into a trap. As the arriving police officers led Cole away, Peter put a hand on Johannes's shoulder. "I warned you not to interfere," he said, but his voice was full of relief. "And I told you we have to stop it," John responded. In that moment, Peter realized that his son was more like him than he had ever imagined. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and challenges. Cole had been arrested, but the investigation dragged on, and Johannes couldn't forget the image of his father facing the consequences of his old life. Peter had offered the money to buy time, but authorities confiscated it as evidence of the network's machinations. John knew his father hadn't gotten his way in everything and wouldn't want to. One cool morning, Johannes and Peter were sitting in the small kitchen. The silence between them was no longer filled with tension, but with thought. "What's wrong with you now?" Johannes finally asked. Peter took a sip of coffee and looked calmly at his son. "I will cooperate with the authorities. There are things I can explain and people I want to protect, but it won't be easy. They will investigate everything." Johannes nodded slowly. "Are you going to jail?" Peter sighed deeply. "Maybe, but that's something I can live with. I've spent enough time hiding. Now it's time to face the consequences. Johannes's thoughts were spinning. The thought of losing his father was painful, but he couldn't deny that he also had respect for him. Peter had not only made mistakes, but he had also tried to bear the weight of his decisions alone. "I'm proud of you," Johannes finally said. The words seemed unexpected, but they came from the heart. Peter smiled slightly. "Thank you, Juan. It means more than you think." Indeed, in the days that followed, father and son began cleaning the house and preparing for the changes to come. Johannes found old photographs and letters that painted a picture of Peter that had until then remained hidden from him. A man who had made mistakes, but who had also tried tirelessly to protect his family. The biggest surprise came when a letter arrived from Peter's lawyer. He explained that some of the money Peter had donated anonymously over the years had been used to support schools, orphanages, and hospitals. Johannes could barely hold back his tears as he read the reports about the positive impact these donations had had. It was proof that his father had tried to do good despite his mistakes. On the day of the hearing, Johannes accompanied his father to court. Peter walked calmly in front of the judge, his shoulders straight and his gaze steady. He admitted his involvement in the smuggling ring and took responsibility for his decisions. Juan was proud of the dignity that Pedro maintained despite everything. The sentence was harsh, but not insurmountable. Peter was sentenced to several years in prison, but was given the opportunity to shorten it by performing community service. For Johannes, it was a bittersweet moment. His father would be punished, but he also had the chance to redeem himself. When Peter went to prison, John stayed behind, determined to turn his father's legacy into something positive. He took a part-time job and began volunteering at the organizations that Peter's donations had supported. He told his stories, letting people know how mistakes had become opportunities for others. Time passed, and when Peter was finally freed, many things had changed. John had gained a new perspective on life and had developed a deeper connection with his father than ever before. Together they decided not to forget their past, but to use it as a lesson. On a sunny spring day, father and son sat on a park bench. Children played nearby and the air was filled with the sounds of life. Peter looked at Johannes with a warm smile on his face. "Thank you for helping me make the right decisions," he said quietly. Johannes shook his head. "You taught me to stand up for what matters. Now it's up to both of us to make the most of it." In that moment, the world felt lighter for both of them. The past was no longer a burden, but the foundation for a new beginning, a story of mistakes, forgiveness, and strength to do the right thing. This story reminds us that the past can shape our lives, but it does not have to determine them. Mistakes, secrets, and wrong decisions can weigh on our path, but it is never too late to take responsibility and start again. It is the connection between honesty, forgiveness, and courage that truly sets us free and shows us how deep family bonds can be. If this story moved you, share your opinion in the comments. Like and share the video with your friends to inspire them too. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any more moving stories. And get ready, because in the next episode you will find an even more surprising and emotional story. Proof that sometimes life creates the biggest plot twists. Click the video below now and experience how an unexpected encounter can change everything.